So today we're going to talk about population ecology. So one thing is important to know what a population is. So we can see this graphic that's showing you some different descriptions of an environment. So we start with the smallest, which is an organism. So that's an individual organism right here. A group of the same organism is called a population. So it's like the same species of organism. That's what a population is. A community is all the living things in a given area. So all the different species in an area. The ecosystem is all the living and non-living things. So that would be all the species in the area plus the climate, the weather, etc. And the biosphere would be the whole planet. So all those ecosystems combined. So population density is how many individuals are living in a given area. It's basically the density times the land area is going to give you the population. It is a function of immigration and emigration. Immigration means animals coming in. Emigration is animals going out. And also birth versus death. So these all kind of work to figure out what the population density is in an area. The population density can either be increasing, decreasing, or staying at equilibrium or staying the same. So you see here, this would be an example of a high density area. You have a lot of trees in an area. And this would be a low density area where you don't have a lot of trees. So again, this is immigration. Immigration is movement into an area. Immigration is movement out. So the total population is going to be a function of births in immigration, so that's animals coming in, and deaths in immigration, which is animals going out. And it also has to do with the rate that that's happening. So one example of this is the population density of the U.S. So each, red dot is the population of a human. You can see the Northeast is very, very populous. The whole kind of eastern side of the country is very populous. The very western side is populous, and you get great big areas where the population density is very low. It's not only how many animals are living in a given area, but how they are what we call dispersed or kind of placed in that area. There's three kind of types of dispersal that can exist: clumped, random, and uniform. So clumped is where the organisms are living kind of in these little clusters, so they're not spread out in the area. Uniform is where they're evenly spread. This is not very common. You see this with penguins. They kind of have their land and they have their radius around them. And then random is where it's just exactly what it sounds like. They're just randomly placed. A lot of dispersal is going to be clumped, and it's going to be clumped around a resource. So we can say that humans even do this. We clump around water, actually. There's a lot of, most humans live within 50 miles of water. And again, random's mostly plants where they kind of just, wherever the seeds land, they're going to grow. And then uniform is it's not that common. Few animals do it. One example would be penguins. So semoparity and interoparity describe how animals reproduce. So in semoparity, the animals are going to reproduce only once in their lifetime. They are usually going to give birth to lots and lots of babies. And the offspring are kind of on their own, meaning there's very low what we call maternal care. So what happens is basically they reproduce, and it's a very large event. They realize most of the babies will not survive, and that's kind of where evolution comes in, where only the strongest ones will survive. So examples of that: salmon. You guys know once salmon spawn, they die. Butterflies, most plants like wheat, and then clams as well. That's called semoparity. The opposite of that is interoparity. This is what you're used to. This is what humans do. So this is where they reproduce repeatedly over their lifetime. They have very few offspring at once. Most survive. And there's high parental or maternal care. So this is how humans reproduce. We have 1 or 2 babies at a time, most likely. Multiple times in our lifespan, we very much take care of those babies, and most of those babies make it to adulthood. So apes, orangutans, lizards, actually bugs and mosquitoes and birds do this. You see birds sit on their nests. That's called maternal care. One is not better than the other. It's just kind of the way that works for that animal. Interoparity and semoparity kind of go along with R selection versus K selection. You can see that they're very similar. So for example, in R selection, you're going to have early reproduction, where K selection, you're going to have late. So humans, for example, are K selected. In R selection, you're going to be semoparitous. You're going to reproduce once. K selection is that interoparity. R selection is where you have many offspring, most of which will not survive. And then K selection is where you're going to have a few large offspring that you take care of. We can also look at K and R selection through this graph. So K selection, you're going to have number of survivors going to be very high. Most species, most organisms are going to survive to adulthood, we call it. And then you get a rapid drop off. Whereas for our selection, a lot of the babies are not going to survive, and it kind of evens out more adulthood. So this is where you're going to have a few babies, most survive, a lot of babies, a lot of them die. There is a second one called a constant mortality, where they kind of just live or die constantly. That's kind of like ground mammals, like for example, here is squirrels. So density independent factors versus dependent factors are factors that depend on how many. So we talk about population density is how many living in a given area. Density independent means it doesn't matter how many are living in a given area. So these are things kind of like weather, natural disasters. So for example, flood, fire, climate change, destruction of habitat, drought. It doesn't matter how many things are living there. Those things are going to affect everything equally. Where density dependent factors do depend on how many. So, for example, food shortages and competition. The more there is in an area, the more problem that is. Disease is another one. Disease is a big one where the more populous the area, the more the disease can be worse. Introduction of an exotic species, increased predation or competition for water and other resources. Again, density independent is where it does not matter how many there are. Density dependent means it does matter how many organisms there are in a given area. This chart here is something you will see on the AP exam. It's pretty common. It's called a boom and bust cycle. And what it's going to do is it's going to follow the population changes of a predator and prey. Usually it focuses on a single predator and prey relationship. So this graph here, you see the snowshoe hare, which is a rabbit, and a lynx, which is a type of big cat. You can see the hare's population is the blue and the lynx is the red. What you're going to see is they do kind of follow each other. So they kind of both go up and both go down. Couple of distinct features though. Notice the hare, the rabbit, its population is going to be higher usually than the lynx, which should make sense because the smaller prey item usually is going to be in the more amount, whereas the lynx is not going to be as many. And then you're also going to see there's a little bit of a lag. So you see here the snowshoe hare goes up, and the lynx does go up, but a little bit later. So the snowshoe hare is going to peak here, and the lynx is going to respond later. And you can see that happens kind of all along. And that should make sense because it's going to take a little bit for, the hare population is going to boom. That's what we call it. It's going to rise. And the lynx population is going to take a little bit to, again, rise because there's going to be more food available. And then same with the drop off, right? The snowshoe hare drops off population, and then a little bit later the lynx will drop off. That's the bust for that very reason. Exponential and logistic describe growth or population growth. Exponential is just like in math, where it's growing at a very rapid rate. The rate is increasing exponentially. It's going bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Where logistic growth is what we call an S curve, where it's going to grow and then hit kind of a point. In ecology, we call that max point the carrying capacity. So the carrying capacity of an environment is how many organisms it can support. So carrying capacity is like how much food there is, how much space there is, how many mates there is. That kind of determines how many organisms can live there. And that's what kind of keeps the population stable. This would be like if you have a fish bowl, you're not going to put 20 fish in a fish bowl. That is over the carrying capacity of the fish bowl. The fish will die. So if you overshoot the carrying capacity, what happens is some of the organisms have to die off. Not all, it doesn't go to zero, but enough to die off to go under that carrying capacity. Right now, the human population overall is growing exponentially. There are some other populations that are growing exponentially. Ecological scientists kind of argue that all population growth is logistic. It's just that when you're seeing exponential growth, you're seeing this part of a logistic graph before it's hit the carrying capacity. So their argument is they're all going to even out. They're all going to hit that carrying capacity. It's just kind of when we see that happening. So there's going to be two kind of, I wouldn't call them problems, kind of skills that you're going to have to do with the ecology unit. One is going to be called a life table. So a life table is going to summarize birth and death rates for organisms at different stages. It's going to tell you the lifespan and longevity of organisms. So, humans, for example, ages 0 to about 3, you're a toddler, then you get to an adolescent, then you get to an adult, and usually our lifespan's around 80, and other animals just have different categories for that. You can use a life table to possibly predict the population or where the population is going. Is it increasing, decreasing, or staying the same? So here is an actual life table. This is a life table for ground squirrels. You can see all the information in it. It has the general ages, it has the females versus the males, and it has things like how many were alive at the start of the year, how many died, what was the death rate, what's the life expectancy. So you can see with this, A lot of the squirrels are alive early in the life. Around 5 to 6, they start to very much decrease. So I would say their lifespan is probably about 5 to 6 years. You have a few surviving, but not a lot. The males actually drop off much quicker, you can see. Males probably have a lifespan of 3 to 4. And again, this is a way you can kind of look at the population and what the population of ground squirrels is going to do. A lot of times with those life tables information, you create a graph called a survivorship curve, which is going to show how many individuals are expected to survive at any age. This can show you a lot of demographics or demography, which is statistics of a population. So births, deaths, it can be even income, incidence of disease, stuff like that. So if you compare the births and deaths in these survivorship curves, you can tell if a population is going to increase, decrease, or stay the same. Like K selection and R selection, there's actually 3 types of survivorship curves. And again, they should look very similar because it's very similar to K selection and R selection. So type 1 survivorship is again where most survive through infancy to adulthood, and then you get a drop off later in life. And so most survive to be old, and the old is where you're going to get the death. In type 3, you get a lot of death in the beginning, not a lot of the babies survive, and then we get some evening off into adulthood. And then again, that type 2 is that consistent rate where they're all kind of, consistently living and dying at the same time. And you are going to have some practice with life tables and survivorship curves, making them and reading them, which is something you need to be able to do for the AP exam.